The subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. As a reminder, I asked all members to keep themselves muted when they are not being recognized. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not being recognized and there is an inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. If you are participating today, please keep your camera on. And if you choose to attend a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. This hearing is entitled A Review of Diversity and Inclusion at America's Largest Investment Firms. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. When I became chair of the first ever subcommittee on diversity and inclusion, asset management was high on the list of priorities that I wanted the subcommittee to focus on, not only because of power, wealth, and the jobs it creates, but also because of the limited data available in this space suggested it was one of the worst performers on diversity and inclusion within the financial sector, services sector. Last Congress, as you will remember, we held a hearing on diverse asset management and heard from researchers from the Knight Foundation, the founder of the largest African-American-owned asset management firm, John Rogers, and Chicago Pension System, a leading institutional investor in diverse asset managers. While this hearing demonstrated the breadth of the problem, we need to hear directly from the country's largest asset managers themselves and give them the opportunity to present us with their own data. That is why earlier this year, I want to thank our chairwoman, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. When she and I worked together, and through her leadership, we sent a letter to the country's 31 largest asset managers companies with more than $47 trillion in asset management, requesting their diversity data, their policies, and practices. After months of analysis, the committee staff published a report earlier this week entitled Diversity and Inclusion, Holding America's Largest Investment Firms Accountable. This wide-range report accounts for how America's largest asset management companies approach diversity and inclusion with respect to their workforce, their board of directors, procurement, asset management, underwriting, procurement, and practices and policies. Also, it includes several recommendations that Congress, regulators, and companies can take to help ensure a more diverse and inclusive asset management industry. Now, here's what we've been waiting for. This report found women and minorities are underrepresented in C-suites and on boards of America's largest asset management firms. A little data. When women, representing 27.5% of the C-suites and 28% of the board seats, and minorities representing 17.3% of the C-suites and 17.5% of the board suites. Only a third of the companies reportedly tracked diversity data with regards to the asset management firms they do business with. Thus, their business diversity. They reported spending on an average of 0.57% of total asset management services with women-owned businesses and 3.9% on minority asset managers. Only 21% of the companies reported tracked diversity data with regards to the underwriting firms they do business with. These findings reinforce what we heard in that initial hearing last Congress from John Rogers, who sat where you're sitting now to testify, when he said, we must tackle inequality through business opportunity. While this report and hearing will not transform the industry overnight, we seek to bend the arc of progress and expand employment and business opportunities for both men and women and minorities by opening eyes and drawing attention to the glaring inequities in this corner of our society. And as I wrap up, let me simply say thank you to the witnesses today and thank all the firms that participated in the data submission for this report. And I look forward to hearing the testimonies of our witnesses today. Now, it gives me great honor to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, a colleague, a friend, someone who takes diversity very seriously, and I'm pleased to now turn the microphone and yield to Ms. Wagner for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The Honorable Ann Wagner.
I thank you, Chairwoman Beatty. You've been a tremendous friend and colleague in this space, and so many others. I want to thank our witnesses also for appearing before this subcommittee to discuss diversity within the asset management industry. Studies have shown that across the financial services industry, companies with a diverse workforce outperform their less diverse peers. A study conducted by Sheen Levine, a professor at Columbia University, found, quote, ethnically diverse trader teams priced assets more accurately, therefore yielding higher returns, while ethnic homogeneity promoted conformity and mispricing. Despite strides in diversity and inclusion across the banking sector, women and minorities within America's asset management sector are still underrepresented. Progress is being made, however, and today's witnesses will provide us with their strategies that have proven successful and also the challenges their firms face in hiring and retaining a diverse workforce. When looking at the report and the data gathered from 31 U.S. firms, it is important to remember that every firm has its own story to tell. While an initiative or a program may yield positive results for one firm, it may not for another. As Mr. Pond, the president and CEO of the Investment Company Institute, said in his testimony, some of their members have been engaged in this area for many years and are leaders. But he also has members that have more recently begun to engage on this issue. Today's hearing should remain focused on what is working, what needs improvement, and also learning about the overall benefits of a diverse workforce. In 2019, I requested a GAO study to assess how firms are supporting increased participation among women in STEM programs at the secondary, the undergraduate, and graduate levels, and what best practices firms are using to recruit and retain women with STEM degrees. Earlier this year, the GAO published this study, which I would request to be submitted to the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection.
The study found several factors affect women's participation in STEM degree programs along with a career in financial services industry. After over a year of research and interviews with stakeholders, this report outlined factors that include young girls' early exposure to STEM topics, access to resources such as computers and high-speed internet, and even a sense of whether they belong in the STEM degree programs. This report also found that in order to encourage elementary or high school girls to learn about STEM, many financial services firms provide funding and other support to nonprofit organizations that focus on increasing girls' participation in STEM, such as ICI's partnership with Girls Who Invest. With this support, nonprofit organizations introduce girls to coding and basic programming and other activities that may inspire interest in STEM education. We also learned that firms offer scholarships to women in STEM, sponsor conferences, and work with colleges and universities to recruit women with STEM degrees. We should be encouraging more partnerships such as those mentioned in this GAO report that I requested. Firms that make the effort to promote interest among women in both STEM and financial services will reap the rewards. I look forward to our further discussions, Madam Chair, with our witnesses about how we can include more women in the financial services industry talent pool and work that they are already doing in this space. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I have the opportunity to recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, a leader, national leader in diversity and inclusion, and committed to making a difference, and is also the founder of this first ever diversity and inclusion subcommittee, no other than the gentlewoman from California, the Honorable Maxine Waters. I yield to you for 1 minute.
Thank you so very much, Chair Beatty. I am so proud that your efforts have culminated in yet another groundbreaking report, this time on the diversity of our nation's largest investment firms. In March 2021, Chair Beatty and I sent letters to 31 firms that manage more than $400 billion in assets and requested their diversity and inclusion data, practices, and policies. The firms in this report oversee assets totaling more than twice the size of the United States GDP. They invest retirement savings of millions of Americans and drive investment in companies and communities. The committee's report makes clear that these firms have much work to do, and transparency and accountability is the path to progress. So I look forward to discussing the findings of this report. And again, I thank you so very much, Chair Beatty, for the progress that you're making in this whole area of diversity and inclusion. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, we will recognize and welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Ms. Michelle Gadsden-Williams, Managing Director, Human Resources, Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with BlackRock. Next, we will have Mr. Eric Pan, President and CEO of the Investment Company Institute, followed by Mr. Ron Parker, President and CEO with the National Association of Security Professionals, better known to many as NASP. Followed by him, we will have Mr. Cyrus Taraporevala, President and CEO at State Street Global Advisors. And finally, we will have Mr. Michael Clements, Director, Financial Markets and Community Investment at the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Please, to all of the members and those watching, we have a hybrid, so there are people seated with us in the room, and I will direct your attention to the screen. Witnesses, you are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime, so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. With that said, Ms. Gadsden-Williams, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the committee, my name is Michelle Gadsden-Williams, and I am the Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at BlackRock. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on BlackRock's behalf in terms of our DEI initiatives. DEI is core to our purpose, and I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss our commitment and our ongoing efforts in this critical area. I've spent over 30 years of my career leading DEI strategies for several multinational organizations in different industries in the US and abroad. So I understand the complexities and nuances, as well as the challenges of this work across businesses and cultures. I chose to join BlackRock in September of last year because I was convinced the organization truly wants to accelerate progress in DEI holistically. From our perspective, DEI is a critical business imperative that will position us and all of our key stakeholders for greater success in the long term. Now that I've been with BlackRock for 15 months, I continue to be impressed, but more importantly, inspired by our unwavering leadership and steadfast commitment, our movement with a real sense of purpose and urgency around issues pertaining to our people and our culture, and our relentless focus to ensure that DEI is not simply about doing the right thing or limited to talent and culture only. To be clear, we still have a lot of work to do at BlackRock, but through our continued commitment and focus, I know that we are on the right path to making meaningful and sustained progress. We've instituted a multi-year DEI strategy which closely aligns with our business imperatives and have 3 distinct pillars to speak of. I will briefly touch on these areas where we've made progress and also on our areas of opportunity. My written testimony includes more detail on each of these things, as well as other aspects of our DEI strategy. First, at the core of our DEI strategy is our most important asset, our people. At the start of each year, we set public representation targets and build goals into each business's objectives. In the summer of 2020, we committed to increasing our overall workplace representation of Black and Latinx employees by 30%, to doubling the number of Black and Latinx senior leaders, and to increasing our senior female representation to 32.5% by 2024. We're hiring women at almost parity and also achieved our initial goal of 30% of senior BlackRock employees being women globally. We've substantially increased the diversity of our new hires to the firm over the past year. Second, BlackRock has increased our supplier and vendor diversity efforts from historically underrepresented groups, including companies owned by and operated by minorities, women, military veterans, disabled veterans, people with disabilities, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. We started dedicated diverse broker and manager programs to increase connectivity and engagement with firms owned by minority, women, and disabled veterans while helping them to grow their businesses. We also established an innovative partnership with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, where we're donating a portion of the net revenues from BlackRock's management fee of the $7.5 billion money market fund to support students of HBCUs and predominantly Black institutions. Third, our diversity strategy also focuses on the positive impact that we can have on the long-term success and sustainability of underserved communities through policy and philanthropic efforts. We strive to lead the industry on transparency, on our diversity disclosures, such as by releasing SASB and EEO-1 disclosures. In 2020, the firm announced a $10 million philanthropic commitment to advance racial equity as part of the firm's long-term social impact initiatives. Importantly, success across DEI strategies requires leadership commitment from the top, and I'm proud of the support and the focus coming from our CEO, Larry Fink, our board of directors, and other senior leaders across BlackRock. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today and to allow me to share more about BlackRock's strategy. We've made meaningful progress, but we certainly recognize that there's so much more work that lies ahead to realize meaningful and substantive change. We appreciate the committee's focus on these important issues, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gadsden-Williams. Mr. Pan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony. Members, please look to the screen.
Chair Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chair Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Investment Company Institute. I'm Eric Pan, and I joined ICI as President and CEO in November 2020. I am very pleased to be here today to share with you both ICI's and our members' commitment to increasing diversity and inclusion in the asset management industry. ICI applauds the work of this committee to make diversity and inclusion a core pillar of ensuring our financial services system works for all Americans. As the leading association representing regulated funds, ICI's members include mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, unit investment trusts, money market funds, and other funds publicly offered to investors in jurisdictions worldwide. With more than $40 trillion in assets under management, our members provide the investment vehicle of choice for more than 100 million Americans, all seeking to create financial security and save for major financial milestones such as education, a home, and retirement. Now, I would like to take this opportunity actually to thank you, Chair Beatty, for your participation this last October in joining the ICI and a panel of industry leaders, including our board chair and CEO of New York Life Investment Management, Yixin Hong. When you came to discuss the importance of increasing diversity and inclusion in the asset management industry. This event was part of ICI's broader initiative to making diversity and inclusion a key priority for us as an organization and for the industry. Now, at this event, Chair Beatty, you made the comment in addressing some of the challenges the asset management industry faces in making real progress. And you had said that the best thing we can do is, quote, be transparent, be accountable, and most importantly, be proud that you are part of making a difference, making a change, and growing this wonderful America that we live in. I fully support your statement. Across our membership, we are seeing a growing momentum in the discussion, and most importantly, in the actions of our members to make diversity and inclusion a top priority. I'm seeing a commitment, an intentionality, and a focus to making progress. Now, this is reflected in the activity of ICI's own Board of Governors, which has set the tone for how important it is for us as an industry to make progress, and is helping ICI launch initiatives to facilitate change across the industry. And I would note that a discussion of diversity and inclusion is a regular agenda item at all ICI Executive Committee and board meetings. Now, as has been noted, some of our members have been engaged in this area for many years and are leaders in the industry in this area, demonstrating the types of initiatives, programs, and measures that work. But we also have members that have only more recently begun to engage on this issue and are trying to identify ways to make changes within and outside of their organizations. All of this to say, we as an industry are a work in progress in developing the strategies, practices, and actions that will achieve enduring results. In my written testimony, I discussed 3 core themes about the industry's work on diversity and inclusion, which also happen to track the subcommittee's focus on examining the financial services industry more broadly. Given time constraints, let me just highlight them here. The first theme is disclosure, which ICI believes enables the industry to have a fact-based dialogue on diversity and its impact on the industry and its investors. The second theme discusses the industry's efforts around measurement and benchmarking to make meaningful progress toward creating a more diverse and inclusive industry in fund management and in fund governance. The last theme is an overview of the initiatives that ICI and the industry have launched to make meaningful progress toward ensuring that women and people of color are fully represented at every level of the asset management industry. In closing, I want to reiterate that the asset management industry plays a significant role in improving the financial well-being of investors by helping them build security. We're well positioned to support women and people of color and also to break down the barriers within the industry. Clearly, the industry must improve in this area, and we are working toward that goal, including at ICI. Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pan, and thank you for quoting me at the conference. Greatly appreciate it. Mr. Parker, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you and good morning. First, I'd like to thank the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Subcommittee, and particularly Chair Waters, Chairwoman Joyce Beatty, and Ranking Member Ann Wagner for having me testify today. My name is Ronald C. Parker, and I serve as the President and CEO of the National Association of Securities Professionals, a trade association that advocates for and supports the development of ethnic minorities within the financial services industry. We work on behalf of over 600 members across the country, with our members coming from large, small, and covering all asset classes. I'm here today to share some information about the current state of the industry when it comes to ethnic minority representation, to share some facts around the realities of minorities in the industry, and some solutions that the NASP organization supports to bolster inclusion, equity in the financial services industry. I'd like to make 4 points in my remark. Point 1, there are substantial resources, over $100 trillion that's under the control of governments, endowments, companies, and other institutions that are managed by third-party investment professionals. While minorities and women-owned asset management firms make up 8.6% of this sector, they only manage about 1.8% of all assets under management. Point 2, we all understand that the consultants, asset managers, and others owe a duty of fiduciary care when selecting asset managers and must pick top-performing, trustworthy managers. However, we know that the minority-owned firms produce some of the best results in the industry, often with fewer resources. Yet, according to the magazine Industrial Investors, research done by the Knight Foundation, as mentioned earlier, these organizations are stuck managing pennies on the dollar. Point 3, we also find that the RFP process requires high levels of assets under management to even consider minority-owned smaller firms for investment opportunities. According to that GEO report that Congresswoman Wagner mentioned, the minimum size requirements for assets under management could potentially exclude smaller minorities and women-owned firms. This process needs to be addressed. Point 4, while these two patterns note the impact in the financial services industry directly, we also believe that the overall support of business supplier diversity will be a key to minority asset managers' success as well. It is imperative that public, private, and nonprofit enterprises embrace business diversity by increasing the utilization of business diverse-owned professional services firms in addition to working within the diverse businesses of their traditional procurement. Now for solutions. NASP supports the passage of the Diverse Investment and Advisors Act, spearheaded by Representative Beatty and championed by the NASP Legislative Committee that was put forth in 2019. By establishing this Rooney Rule, or we would suggest the Beatty Rule, these firms will be guaranteed the opportunity to make their case alongside other firms in the process that is less about long-standing relationships, but more about bringing in new investment philosophies and strategies to the table. This legislation would specifically address the issues of fiduciary care by ensuring that the top-performing minority and women-owned firms, regardless of ownership, have access to same RFP process and competitive processes of those firms. NASP also stands behind the legislation to amend the Dodd-Frank Act, Section 342, by requiring that the diverse and inclusion efforts are tracked and added to the Uniform Financial Institutions Rating System. This legislation will require that firms track their diversity efforts and performance and hold accountability of a person who is in the office of the CEO. We also realize that NASP has worked very closely with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and we'd like to compliment Gilbert Garcia and Garcia Hamilton and Associates for their work of recommending changes as it relates to the Office of Minority and Women-Owned Inclusion Matters of the SEC. It is our hope that through legislation, rulemaking, as well as data collection and analysis, that we frame and execute creative ways to address this issue. We must move from promises to practice to process. I thank you, and I yield back my time to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Parker, for your testimony. And now we will recognize Mr. Taraporevala to be recognized for 5 minutes to give oral presentation on your testimony. Please look to the screen.
Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify today. I'm Cyrus Taraporevala, the Chief Executive Officer of State Street Global Advisors, the $4 trillion investment management arm of State Street Corporation, headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. The evidence is clear. Greater diversity, racial, ethnic, cultural, and gender, contributes to better corporate performance. While I'm proud of State Street's actions and achievements to date, increasing diversity and inclusion remains a work in progress for all of us, and there's clearly a lot more work ahead of us. Hence, I support the committee's efforts in this area. In July 2020, we announced our 10 actions to address issues of racism and inequality, which have now become an important part of our corporate culture and governance and go to the core of how we operate. I provide more details in my written submissions, but here are a few highlights of some of our progress, which fall under 3 broad pillars. Firstly, for our board and workforce, we've increased the racial diversity of our corporate board from 9% to 25%. We've adopted a global diverse candidate slate requirement for hiring of middle management and above, the US version of which is commonly referred to as the Rooney Rule. We've committed to the MLT Black Equity at Work certification, and we recently announced we will undertake a full civil rights audit to gain additional perspective and strengthen our programs and initiatives, and we now recognize Juneteenth as a corporate holiday. Secondly, for our industry and other stakeholders, we enhanced the diversity and effectiveness of the syndicates underwriting our corporate debt by introducing Black, Latinx, women, and veteran-owned firms in issuances of $1.3 billion over the past year. We conducted an audit of our charitable foundation, resulting in our formally including racial equity as a funding focus. We've announced strategic partnerships with industry groups and nonprofits, A Better Chance, the National Association of Securities Professionals, the Twigo Foundation, and the Association of Luxembourg Fund Industry to increase representation of Black and Latinx talent in our industry. And thirdly, for the companies in which we invest. In 2017, we launched our Fearless Girl campaign to draw attention to gender diversity in boardrooms. You may be familiar with the statue we placed on Wall Street, which identified 1,500 companies lacking women on their boards, 900 of which have since added at least one woman director. In 2020, we expanded that campaign to include racial and ethnic diversity. We've urged our portfolio companies to disclose the racial and ethnic composition of their boards, and over time, to add at least one director from underrepresented communities. We've also called for companies to disclose their EEO-1 data on employees, which is something we do. We've made significant progress, but as the committee's report reveals, there remains much more to be done. Sustainable, meaningful advancements in diversity and inclusion require enduring changes to the way we all operate. And State Street, and I personally, am committed to staying that course. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Taraporevala, for your testimony today. And now, Mr. Clements, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony. Look to the screen.
Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our prior work addressing key practices to increase opportunities for minority and women-owned asset managers in federal retirement, insurance, and endowment programs. The financial services industry provides services that help families build wealth and is essential for the economic well-being of the country. However, GEO's prior work has shown that financial services industry has made limited progress in increasing diversity. Federal retirement, insurance, and endowment programs control significant financial resources, which could provide opportunities for minority and women-owned asset managers. Yet, we previously found limited participation among diverse asset managers in federal programs. We identified 4 key practices that can be used as part of an institutional investor's asset management selection process to help ensure that qualified minority and women-owned firms are considered. We identified these key practices through a review of industry reports and interviews with state, local, and private retirement plans and foundations, and we subsequently validated these practices by obtaining feedback from experts and industry stakeholders. The first key practice, top leadership commitment. Top leadership should demonstrate commitment to increasing opportunities for minority and women-owned asset management firms. The second key practice, remove potential barriers. Investors should review policies and practices to remove barriers that limit participation of smaller, newer firms. For example, investors could adjust thresholds for assets under management, insurance, and length of track record to ensure that requirements are proportional to the size of the firm. The third key practice, outreach. Investors should conduct outreach to inform minority and women-owned asset managers about investment opportunities and the selection process. For example, investors can meet with industry associations and participate in networking events with minority and women-owned asset managers. In the fourth key practice, communicate priorities and expectations. Investors should explicitly communicate priorities and expectations about inclusive asset management practices to staff and consultants and ensure that those expectations are met. It's important to note that these practices do not require investors to develop allocations for minority and women-owned asset management firms or to change performance standards. Further, many non-federal plans and foundations we interviewed have implemented these practices to increase opportunities for minority and women-owned firms and told us that using these practices does not conflict with their fiduciary responsibilities. Rather, firms are selected based on their track record of performance and that they may benefit their clients. In our 2017 report, we examined to what extent 7 federal retirement, insurance, and endowment programs use these key practices. The Federal Reserve System, Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and the Smithsonian Institution used all 4 practices. In contrast, the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board used none of the key practices, and other federal entities used some. We recommended that the board and the other entities fully implement the key practices. In the intervening year, the board and other entities have taken actions to address our recommendations. For example, the trustees of the Army Air Force Exchange Service Pension Plan issued a letter to plan consultants stating that it was the trustees' intent to increase opportunities for minority and women-owned asset managers and requested that the consultant take action to increase opportunities for those asset managers. Our work has shown that implementing a more inclusive selection process for asset managers can widen the pool of candidates, which can help ensure that retirement plans and foundations are identifying the best asset managers and better manage investment risk. Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clements, for your testimony and comments. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. The first question is for you, Ms. Michelle Gadsden-Williams. As a professional with more than 25 to 30 years of experience, how important is it for someone in your position to be empowered to have a buy-in with the CEO, with the board? And what is your actual level of interaction with both at BlackRock?
Thank you, Chair Beatty, for the question. So I think it's critically important that I have access and exposure to the right leaders in the organization in order to accelerate progress on DEI. I report to the Chief Human Resources Officer at BlackRock, Manish Mehta, who reports to our CEO, Larry Fink. I report regularly to our Board of Directors. I just presented to them in March when we unveiled our strategy to the entire firm and to the board, and 6 months later, I gave them an update in terms of where we are relative to our progress. So to answer your question, it is incredibly important for me to have access and exposure and also feel a sense of commitment from these entities that we are committed to doing the right thing. If I may, one of the many reasons why I decided to join BlackRock is a couple of things. There are several things that I look for in my conversations with CEOs and other leaders when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the courage to act, the commitment to lead, and the conviction to change. And if any of these things are missing from that conversation, I tend to look elsewhere because I've seen the movie before where there are organizations that aren't quite as committed. And I was convinced when I was being courted by BlackRock a year and a half ago, and even more so now that I'm on the inside, that we are committed to DEI and doing all of the things and have consistently demonstrated actions that convince me as their head of diversity globally that we are committed to accelerating the pace of change going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we will be following that commitment to change. So I have made a special note of that, and you may tell your president and CEO I said so. The next question is for you, Mr. Pan, on the screen. From the findings of the report, only 32% of the firms reported tracking asset management spend, only about 21% reported in tracking underwriting spending. I'm a firm believer of what doesn't get counted doesn't get measured, and that doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So as a trade association that represents many of these firms, how can you commit to assisting these firms standardize tracking these metrics and encouraging your members to implement data collection? And I only have a short period because I'm trying to get to everybody, so if you could give me the abbreviated answer.
Well, I think the short answer is it's got to start from tone from the top, right? As I said in my opening statement, there is a commitment at ICI to improve diversity and inclusion. When we, as the Board of Governors, who are the leaders of the industry, they get together, they talk about D&I, there's clearly a change in tone. A lot of the desire for better metrics, better information has got to start off with first a recognition of the issue, and we are there. I think when we talk more granularly about what can be provided, that these are discussions that are ongoing right now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Parker, this question is for you. Chair Waters worked very hard and allowed me to work with her to get the SEC's Federal Advisory Board on asset management to focus more on D&I. I know also that NASP joined in support of writing a letter. As you may know, on November the 4th, the SEC's Asset Management Advisory Committee disbanded. Do you believe this is a misstep by the SEC to not reconstitute an advisory committee to ensure more diversity representation?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Waters, Beatty, for the question. Yes, I do, and we believe that it's a misstep. Why? Because we have seen that while there's oversight and governance by the regulatory agencies, having an external point of view to be registered on the record, and it starts with the conversation. The art of the conversation is all about leadership. And we think by reconstituting this particular advisory council will serve as a resource to the SEC in getting what we call on the street, Main Street feedback of what's working well and what needs to be addressed going forward.
Thank you for that, and we would like to follow up with you on that. I only have 3 seconds left, but Mr. Clements and Mr. Taraporevala, I will have questions I will send to you because I enjoyed hearing your testimony. At this time, at the request of our minority chair, ranking member, she has asked that we recognize Mr. Rhodes now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Beatty, and thanks to the ranking member for her gracious indulgence. Thank you also for holding this subcommittee hearing on this important topic, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking time to join us today and testify and for your thoughtful, prepared statements. Mr. Taraporevala, maybe I got that right, State Street Global Advisors Inclusion and Diversity webpage states that in August 2020, State Street launched 10 actions to directly address and strengthen racial equity across your firm, and I believe you mentioned that in your opening statement. How do you define equity versus equality?
Thank you for the question. We view equity as really a level playing field in every sense of the word. And there's lots of technical definitions to it, which I won't get into, but it's really a level playing field. And I think that's the key. Thank you
for that insight. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, the word equity appears in your business title, so I think this will be a fairly easy question for you. How do you define equity versus equality?
So as a seasoned DEI executive, as you can imagine, diversity of yesteryear was focused on, it was more of a headcount exercise versus inclusion, which speaks more to the environments that we're trying to create. Equity speaks to, which is the most important factor in the equation, at least in my view, and it's all about creating parity, fairness, fair outcomes, and to advancement by way of policies and programs for all individuals within an organization.
Thank you as well. On September 22nd, 2021, the Heritage Foundation held a panel discussion entitled, quote, "Unequal Protection, the Push to Replace Equality with Equity is Unconstitutional." This discussion was held as a part of the Heritage Foundation's Preserve the Constitution 2021 event series. The description of the event states that, quote, "Equity is being embraced wholesale by schools, corporate America, and even the Biden administration. It has infiltrated hiring, curriculum, admissions, trainings, and more. But equity is not the same as equality and delivers very different results. Rather than providing all individuals with equal opportunities to succeed, equity segregates individuals by race while driving a narrative of oppressor versus victim. It calls for institutions to treat people unequally in order to achieve equal outcomes. Equity recklessly embraces legally prohibited classifications as a way to eliminate perceived differences in outcome in violation of equal protection and federal law," end quote. Mr. Taraporevala, do you believe that it is fair to use equity as an excuse to treat people unequally in order to achieve a desired outcome?
With all due respect, I don't actually agree with those definitions that you just laid out.
And so to the question, though, do you believe that it is fair to use equity as an excuse to treat people unequally?
No, as I said, the definition is an equal playing field, both in terms of the inputs and the outcomes.
Thank you. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, do you believe that it is fair to use equity as an excuse to treat people unequally in order to achieve a desired outcome?
Thank you for your question, Representative. I am a firm believer that equity is far more important than equality. They are very different, at least in my opinion. It is all about creating the right opportunities, the right support systems and mechanisms so that all individuals will have an opportunity to realize their ambitions internally. So that is my response to your question, Representative.
In the remaining moments I have left, about a year and a half before I was born, back in February of 1965, Dr. King, in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I fear that equity, as it's currently defined and is being implemented across our society, will take away the essence of Dr. King's dream. I have 2 little children, and I hope they can grow up in a country where they will be judged based on the content of their character. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chairwoman Beatty, if I may just weigh in on this, given my numerous years in the private sector, I'd like to weigh in that diversity is a fact.
Mr. Parker, at this time, we may have to come back and someone will yield because the gentleman controls the time and his time has expired.
Okay.
But at this time, the chair will recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, who is also the chair of the Committee on Financial Services and the founder of this first ever Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Beatty. Ms. Gadsden-Williams and Mr. Taraporevala, I believe it is, Taraporevala. I'm committed to ensuring highest returns for consumers and retirees. And we've heard today that diverse asset managers perform as well, if not better, than non-diverse asset managers. Both BlackRock and State Street manage the Thrift Savings Plan, the TSP, the largest retirement plan in the world. And I'm concerned that BlackRock and State Street have not done enough to ensure actual diversity in business, specifically contracting with diverse asset managers and related businesses. Ms. Gadsden-Williams and Mr. Taraporevala, the TSP has done very little. The Federal Thrift Investment Board, which manages the TSP, was called out in October 2020 and again in November 2021 by Senator Menendez. What steps have been taken at BlackRock and State Street to increase engagement with diverse asset managers and related firms? Yes.
We at BlackRock, we are committed to both supplier and vendor diversity as well as asset managers. We have a number of programs in place, and our goal is to increase the number of diverse brokers, the number of diverse managers, the number of diverse suppliers. It is our goal to remain connected and to engage with these individuals so that we can continue on this journey. It's certainly an area of opportunity for us. We recognize that, but we certainly recognize what we have a lot of work to do there. But it's certainly, we are certainly committed to it.
Let me ask you, have you responded to Mr. Menendez's inquiry about the pilot program, trying to get information about what progress has been made? Are you aware of his very, very strong letter that was directed toward BlackRock?
Thank you for your question, Chairwoman Waters. Unfortunately, this is out of my purview. I cannot answer that question, but I will circle back with my colleagues so that we can revert back to you and your office with a response to that question.
You mentioned, and I'm very interested in contracting, because Ms. Beatty and I are interested in wealth building, and this is one of the areas that if minority asset firms were contracted with, this could create a lot of wealth in our communities. So you mentioned that you have done better or well contracting with LGBT, Black, Latinx. Could you give me some definitive numbers on that?
With all due respect, Chairwoman Waters, I do not have that information in front of me. Again, that is outside of my scope of responsibility. My colleagues and I, we will revert back to your office with those specifics.
Mr. Taraporevala, could you give me some information about what is happening and what progress have you made working with this tremendous opportunity that you have been afforded, basically doing the contracting and working with our PGGC?
Chairwoman Waters, let me first and foremost reiterate that we are very committed to increasing the diversity of our suppliers and vendors. And this year we have increased our spend with diverse suppliers by over 50%. In my earlier remarks,
Could you
I also mentioned.
Could you disaggregate that for me? Tell me how many contracts, what are the percentage of contracts with Blacks, with Latinx, with women? What do they amount to? What's the bottom line of the, can you give us some definitive information?
I will have to get back to you with those details. Let me then come to your question about the TSP, which, as you know, is overseen by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. We are hired as a manager by that board, and we run the money for those mandates ourselves internally. And therefore, my prior comments about how we are committed to increasing the diversity of our workforce is the most relevant question when it comes to how we run those mandates and perform the job for which we have been hired.
Okay, Ms. Beatty, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time. I know you have a lot of others who have questions, but I think we need definitive information when they come before us. Otherwise, we don't know what they're doing.
Thank you, and I certainly agree with the chairwoman, and I would say to those last two witnesses that per our guidelines, the expectation is you'll have a time limit to submit those answers in writing to this committee. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. The gentlewoman from Missouri, who is also the ranking member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, Ms. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, in your testimony, you mentioned BlackRock's leadership development programs. Could you describe the Women Leadership Forum and how this program has helped women achieve senior level positions?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Wagner. So the Women in Leadership program, WIL, is one of our signature leadership development programs where we identify high potential women in the organization, put them through a rigorous learning and development opportunity to upskill themselves in a number of different ways, from core competencies, technical competencies, behavioral competencies, and they have sponsors and so forth that are also assigned to them in the program as a support mechanism, that's essentially the crux of the program.
When did you begin the program, and what has been its evolution? When did you begin this program?
I'm sorry?
When did you begin this program, and what has been its evolution?
Unfortunately, I don't have the timing of when we started. That was prior to my tenure at
So it's been in
BlackRock.
place for some time.
Yes, it has been in place for some time.
What, in the United States, what % of senior BlackRock employees are women? Do you have that figure?
43%.
43%.
Correct.
Pretty amazing. Well, I'd be very interested to know the genesis of your WIL program, the Women in Leadership program, and how that has developed to allow you to reach a place of some 43% of BlackRock employees, of senior BlackRock employees in leadership. Mr. Pan, we've discussed in this subcommittee the results of firms implementing a Rooney Rule when it comes to candidates being considered for a position. But I am interested in hearing how this reverse Rooney Rule is working for your member firms. Could you please discuss the hiring practices of ICI's member firms and how many of them require diverse interview panels and slates for new hires?
So I don't have the information as to specific firms and their experience and practice with these types of interview panels. What I can tell you is that one of the initiatives that the ICI has done is we have a special committee of members focused on D&I where they come together and they exchange information about their experiences. So they share best practices, they share ideas, innovations that they're doing to try to tackle D&I. I think one takeaway from these discussions is firms are very different from each other. They have unique circumstances. So we do not have one program that all of them do, nor does, not to use the phrase, but one size fits all is often not the solution. But instead, I think that there's great value to them kind of picking the brains of each other. So that is going on right now. Unfortunately, I don't have specific information about how individual firms have their experience with respect to these types of interview panels.
I'd like to ask this first to Ms. Gadsden-Williams and then Mr. Pan, time allowing. When it comes to diversifying the workforce within the financial services industry, past witnesses have highlighted that diversifying the talent pool kind of as a key solution. The lack of female and minority students enrolled in STEM programs at the high school and college level has led to a pipeline problem that is creating challenges across the financial services industry. How can asset management industry better increase participation in STEM-related fields of study for college, high school, and even middle school students in America? Ms. Gadsden-Williams first.
I couldn't hear very well.
Okay, Mr. Pan, or Mr. Pond, pardon me, did you hear my question?
I'm sorry.
Yes, I did.
Just one moment.
So basically, there's two parts. We see it as it's education and it's exposure. Meaning, part of it is how do you get these students, whether they be in STEM, and of course, asset management looks for talent in a wide variety of disciplines, even non-STEM. How do you even get them aware of career opportunities in our industry? So we partner with organizations, especially those organizations that do work a lot with women and minority students, to just make them aware. That's the education part. Then there's the exposure part. For those students who are interested in exploring careers in the field, how do they make themselves known? And so through outreach to, yes.
My time has expired, but I would submit to all of you, take a look at the GAO study that I requested in 2019, the findings that came out. I think this is a very important pipeline issue that we need to tackle when it comes to getting women and minorities involved in STEM field and financial services industry. I appreciate the chair's indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you to the gentle lady. The chairwoman, the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So appreciative of your leadership in convening this hearing. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, thank you for being here today. BlackRock has an office in Boston, as you well know, and employs some of my constituents. And the well-being of my constituents is very important to me. Over the last year, many brave employees and former employees have come forward to share their experiences of sexism, sexual harassment, and racism at BlackRock. These stories are deeply troubling. Esma Bengambizia, an Arab-American Muslim woman, was mocked for using a standard Muslim greeting, repeatedly bullied, threatened with sexual harassment, and called un-American. A Black woman was sexually harassed by her manager. Latinx and Black employees have been called aggressive. A Black gay employee was told to, quote, not be too flamboyant, unquote. Your head of international and corporate strategy, Mark Weidman, has been identified as notorious for making inappropriate comments, especially towards women, yet he remains in a leadership position. The problem is clearly a systemic one. Hiring women and people of color into a hostile environment where they promptly leave traumatized is not the progress that we're aiming for. In fact, it's not progress at all. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, according to your testimony, BlackRock has increased the diversity of its new hires. I'm interested to know if these new hires are sticking around. Is the retention rate for Black and brown employees as high as the retention rate for white employees?
Thank you for your question, Representative Presley. So the events that you're speaking of and recounted in recent reports have absolutely no place at BlackRock, and we've taken some actions to build a more inclusive work environment within our firm. And some of the activities that we've done in response to those claims is improving training for all employees, providing discussion venues to raise concerns, increasing accountability for inclusivity, including among our senior leaders and managers who have an obligation to ensure that we are creating the right kind of environment to address non-inclusive behavior when they see it. So to answer the second part of your question, I do not have those stats in front of me at the moment, but I will revert back to you and your office on those statistics around retention of women and/or people of color.
Yes, and specifically, is there a retention gap? And how disparate is it according to white employees? And so, as the chair mentioned earlier, for all of the data points that we're seeking, there'll be a timeline. And so we eagerly await your response. What about the retention rate for women versus men?
Again, Representative, I don't have those stats in front of me at the moment. I would rather come back to you with firm statistics and data to support this conversation. So we will revert back to your office with that information in due course.
Okay. And what about, would you happen to have any information on promotion rates? Are the promotion rates for the new hires who are women and people of color as high as white male employees? And are they being hired into management or revenue generating roles at the same rate as administrative roles? I'm just building upon what Chairwoman Waters was alluding to, and your earlier testimony and saying that there needs to be a paradigm shift, and one that you certainly want to be leading is that diversity is not about counting heads, but it's really about inclusion. And we also care about promotion and wealth building, especially since there is such a large racial wealth gap, and that certainly abounds in my district. So can you speak to any of those promotion rates, or where people are being hired into? Are they in administrative roles, management, or revenue generating roles?
Year over year, we have seen increases in terms of diverse talent pipelines from women, people of color, particularly Black professionals and Latinx professionals. I do not have the specific data that you're requesting to cite at this moment, but we will revert back to you with that information. But I can confidently say, based on our pipeline efforts and initiatives that we have in place, from recruiting, retention, promotions, we have annual talent reviews that are meaningful. I think we have all the right systems and processes in place to ensure that year over year we are making meaningful substantive changes in those areas and making sure that women and/or people of
Claiming my time. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to get one more question in on the record, and we look forward to your getting that to us. I spoke with a former BlackRock employee who told me the firm has offered victims of sexism or racism a severance benefits package tied to an NDA, which prohibits them from speaking publicly about their experience or suing for any
I'm
reason.
sorry, the
Employees
gentlewoman
who
from
lower
Massachusetts, your time has expired, but you
Thank you.
can enter it into the record and we will request that response.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty and Ranking Member Wagner, for holding this hearing today, and to our witnesses for agreeing to be here with us to discuss this important topic. While there is still a lot of work to do, I have been encouraged by the progress we've seen in recent years, and I'm encouraged by the conversation that we're having here today in many ways. My perspective has always been, you should probably get your own house in order first before you start sort of pushing others to do things that you yourself might not be willing to do. And so with that in mind, I sent a letter along with Rep. Beatty, Wagner, and Sylvia Garcia to the PBGC, encouraging them to expand their pilot program aimed to include smaller asset managers and maintain commitment to including women in diverse-owned firms while still maintaining their fiduciary responsibility. Mr. Parker, my first question is going to be for you. Do you believe that there are other opportunities that we should focus on to promote women in diverse-owned firms within the various federally run pension programs while maintaining fiduciary standards?
Thank you for the question, Representative. Yes, I do believe that we should institute intentional systems to gain exposure to talent that may not be recognized, to potential that may not be fully tapped. And I think by having an intentional, structured program with some regularity, it will build a cadence of engagement.
Thank you. Some of the institutional investors that we've spoken with, I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Parker, that we've spoken with, what they would say is, we have these emerging manager programs where we try to get smaller firms, more diverse asset managers in the door, and then they can hopefully graduate to sort of the bigger platform where they can get the major investments from the institutions. They've described, some of them have described sort of a chasm where the jump from emerging manager to sort of the full portfolio, there's a fallout that happens. I guess in your world, have you observed something similar? And if so, what do you think we can do to bridge that gap to make sure that more people can cross that chasm, if you will?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I would say to you that intentional mentoring, protege programs that will allow for these emerging managers at a certain stage to be exposed to new areas of the financial services sector, cryptocurrency, ETFs. We are working with some members who are in this particular hearing to create unique ways in which proteges and mentors can exchange ideas and build upon experiences and capabilities that can be useful in that growth trajectory, but yet not subjecting any firm to underperforming against its aspirations and the principles and standards of the clients.
Great. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, same question if you could. Question I just asked was, how do we help diverse asset managers bridge that gap from sort of emerging manager programs to the broader platform for major institutional investors?
Thank you for the question, Representative. Generally speaking, we are very much committed to diversifying our asset management. We're certainly committed to this, but this is certainly outside of my purview and role, area of responsibility. So,
fair point. Mr. Parker, back to you. You mentioned cryptocurrencies. We had a great hearing on this yesterday. One of the things that excites me about cryptocurrencies is I think it presents an opportunity for minority communities to get in at the ground level of a technology revolution and sort of to reverse some of the previous discrimination we've seen in the traditional finance sector. How do you view cryptocurrencies in the context of the broader diversity and inclusion discussion?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say any area that is an emerging area allows for underrepresented groups to get in on the ground floor. And I think with cryptocurrency, with blockchaining, other new age fourth industrial revolution tendencies allows for women and minority-owned firms to get in, to understand the mystery behind it, yeah, but at the same time be fully engaged in building the capacity to take advantage of it in the future.
Thank you. And I have 20 seconds left. I'm going to just make one point. This is sort of I don't know how this will land, but we'll go for it. So the term Latinx gets used a lot. I'm Latino, Hispanic, Cuban American. If you look at surveys amongst Hispanic populations, it's not clear that that's a term that folks like to have put on them. So I see it in a lot of the testimonies, and I guess I would just encourage your firms to be thoughtful in how you address folks and maybe survey your own population, but also look at the broader Hispanic Latino community as we go forward. I think that would be very helpful for everybody. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, who is also the chair of the Task Force on Financial Technologies, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I do appreciate the opportunity. Just as a threshold matter, I'm a little surprised that none of our witnesses have come up with any data or any any benchmarks that reflect the diversity and inclusion in their companies. And I just want to remind people that this is the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion. And the name of this hearing, the title of this hearing is A Review of Diversity and Inclusion at America's Large Investment Firms. That's why you were invited here. And so when repeatedly hear that people don't have numbers on this, I mean, what did you think we were going to ask you about? So we got to do better on this. When you get invited to this hearing, you need to be ready to help us with our work. So as the chair remarked, I chair the task force on fintech, and here's the problem. It merges, as you know, the worlds of finance and the world of technology are being merged, and it's really the future of the industry in fintech. And so finance is a world that has been hostile to or unwelcoming to women and people of color. Technology is also an industry and a world that has been hostile to women and people of color. And now we're merging them both, and that we have a big problem. So here's the thing. Along with Congresswoman Presley, we represent Boston, and so we have a lot of people in both those worlds, and we're trying to introduce our constituents into those worlds and make those entities more diverse. My problem is that, so I started a charter school. I've co-founded a public charter school, one of the most diverse in the city, probably one of the most diverse in the country. And we're focused on creating workers for your industry, finance and technology. And one of our biggest problems is getting teachers to come into those schools and actually help us educate the workers of the future. We had a hiring round not too recently, not that long ago, where we got hundreds of applications from English teachers, but when we tried to hire math and science, we got like 9 responses for 3 positions. So what you could do, and I'm speaking to BlackRock and others, what you could do to help us, and this goes to the pipeline issue that Ms. Wagner raised and others have raised. Help us so if someone has math and science skills, they're not coming into our public schools and teaching. They're going making the big money in finance and technology. Help us, you could establish chairs at some of these public schools, public charter schools, where you supplement someone's pay to teach math and science and finance in these schools. My charter school starts at 5th grade. You can't wait till a kid shows up at your door as an adult and try to make them, try to train them in some of this. They have to have a good, solid foundation. So, look, there's a solution here. It would be good for your industry to help us educate the workers of the future who are going to work for you. We got to change the way we think about this. And now I appreciate the internships and like that, but we got to start much younger. We got to build math and science skills, technology skills in these kids before they ever arrive on your doorstep. And so I'm asking you to focus on that. And I know there's very nascent efforts in this regard, but we got to do better at this. And it'll be good for your industry. It'll be good for the people that we're trying to help, and it will build a future. Is anybody doing anything like that in the early years? Can I ask any of our witnesses, anybody doing something at elementary school, grade school, and high school level?
So if I may respond, Chairwoman?
Yes, if I may, Madam Chair, very quickly. Well, with
Take that in
NASP, we
writing.
have
My time is almost expired. Any responses that you have, I'll take in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you so much to the gentleman from Massachusetts. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Lack of diversity is not always an easy problem to solve because root causes are often complex and subtle. I think one way we can ensure we continue to make progress in this area is to have a candid dialogue about what is working and what is not working. If we do that, we can learn from each other and not be shamed for things we are trying, but may not yet be yielding immediate results. So I'd like to open it up to the entire panel. What are the challenges you are facing? What are you struggling with? Is there a factor here that we are not seeing that you think we should be aware of and consider? Mr. Parker, we'll take you first.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think there's a cadence that needs to be established around this particular topic with some degree of frequency. Leadership starts with the conversation, and I think by having quarterly meetings, brown bag luncheons, somewhere where we can engage and share what's working, what's not working. But to the question that was earlier, we are investing in a fast-track program that deals with young high school professionals, but also getting to young professionals. Well, there are a plethora of ideas out there, best practices that we can deploy to address your particular question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? Well, I guess
So I would just like to,
go ahead. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Congressman, so this is Eric Pan from the Investment Company Institute. I would just like to, again, indicate that, we have made efforts to do exactly what you're suggesting, which is getting our members together, having them exchange information about different initiatives that they're doing, learning from each other, what's working, what's not working. And I'd be happy to provide a list of things that have been discussed so far, but we're very much in agreement with what you had said.
Thank you. I serve, oh, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
In terms of challenges around DEI, what I've seen over the years is transparency and accountability are, in my view, key ingredients to any successful DEI strategy. And without that, I just don't know how you can measure and track progress over time. So as a firm, one of the many things that we've done is we have several ways that we tie performance reviews and pay or compensation to our DEI strategy. We begin at the very top. We have a top-down approach to accountability, starting with our Global Executive Committee. Their performance assessments and compensation are assessed and determined by how they deliver against the DEI and/or talent strategies. Second, at the business level, we track and measure progress over time. So we have quarterly business reviews, we have talent reviews, we have diversity dashboards that track things like hiring and retention and development. We have integrated DEI into the performance management process. So in sum, I think you cannot make progress without holding leaders and/or others accountable to DE&I. So that's a challenge that I've seen over the years where things can certainly unravel.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll have one follow-up question for you. So I serve in the Air Force, and the military's been struggling with this for years. And as an officer in the South Carolina Air National Guard, I was at training just about a year and a half ago, and we had a lot of these conversations. And one of the things that came up was, how do we make sure that we are focusing on diversity and inclusion and giving people opportunities that deserve opportunities without disadvantaging other people that may not be diverse but have had very challenging lives? How do you address that?
I think you do that by focusing on inclusion. It's all about the collective we and not the individual. So I think the more in which you can talk about DEI, it's all about all of us and not some of us. That is the position that we've taken at BlackRock. And I think that's where I think the success and where people turn corners philosophically around this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's about the collective we and not just the individual.
Sure. We had very frank conversations at training, and it was very challenging because a lot of people that enter the military do so for economic opportunity because they have not had opportunities wherever they grow up, regardless of their race, skin color. And it was a point of contention. So I think we got to make sure that we're factoring in equity for socioeconomic disadvantaged individuals and make sure that we're moving everyone forward together.
Yes. If I may also add, Representative, when we talk about diversity, I think to your point, we should talk about it in all of its dimensions. A lot of organizations talk about gender and/or ethnic minorities, but there are other dimensions of diversity that get less airplay. LGBTQ, veterans, individuals with disabilities, and so forth.
I got to yield back. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Timmons. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman and the witnesses for being with us today. At the risk of repeating what we have heard over and over, but I don't think we can repeat it enough, increasing diversity and inclusion, and I would suggest beyond inclusion, belonging, is not only the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, it's the right thing to do for the bottom line. An analysis by McKinsey using 2019 data found that firms with higher gender and ethnic cultural diversity were likely to be more profitable than less diverse firms. So Ms. Gadsden-Williams, Mr. Taraporevala, specifically to BlackRock, specifically to State Street, how does increasing diversity improve bottom line? What numbers do you have? What data can you share? What measurements are there?
There is, thank you for your question, Representative. There's enough empirical data and research in the ethos to substantiate the business case for DE&I. We as an organization have decided that it is in fact a business critical imperative based on that empirical data and research. In terms of how and what specific numbers, I do not have that information in front of me, but what I can assure you based on my years of experience, that there's enough research that would substantiate all of the things that you've cited.
You're absolutely right, we've seen the research, but I'm just wondering internally, maybe you could get back to us with whatever measure you have, specifically to BlackRock. Mr. Taraporevala for State Street.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Dean. I think you've just mentioned two great data points off data which demonstrate that, in fact, diverse teams do result in better outcomes in terms of profitability. There's been a plethora of studies. I could quote a lot, whether it's an MSCI study on gender diversity and how companies with more
Pardon me, I'm asking for State Street specifically. Do you have measurements on this?
On the outcomes, I think that's pretty hard. I'm not sure that given all the data that's already been accumulated, that searching for more data is the critical thing. I think the real focus needs to be on action and moving the needle on diversity and inclusion.
I would disagree. I would think within an organization you'd want to see and bear out the proof on increasing diversity, increasing profitability. I recently came across an interesting article in the Philadelphia Tribune by some faculty at Wharton highlighting that effective diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging is key to retention, which should be especially of interest to corporate America, given that we are in the midst of the so-called Great Resignation. The authors note the importance of middle managers, not just senior executives, in creating a truly inclusive workplace. Mr. Parker, could you speak to that notion of how do we make sure that we have diversity in middle management, especially at this tumultuous time?
Yes, thank you for the question. It starts at the top, Congresswoman. It starts with the CEO, the leadership, the board, really. Governance, intervention, making sure that there are processes in place. It starts with the CEO, his or her staff, going down to the next level of those who are running operating divisions, and then getting into what we call the frozen middle, the middle management group, and making sure they understand that growth is contingent upon having a workforce that's reflective of their customer base. So by measuring it and looking at it, just like we do revenue, profitability, and market share, these things can be accomplished inside of organization. But it takes intentionality and accountability at the top.
It really does take intentionality. I remember having a roundtable on diversity in my district, and a government leader said, you know, I believed we were, and he's African American, he's a highly elected person, he said, I believed we were a diverse community of staff and employees, and he said, I actually looked around and found we weren't. He said, we need to be intentional, and actually, we think we are, and sometimes we're not. Ms. Gadsden-Williams, I wanted to ask you quickly, and maybe Mr. Parker quickly also, there's so much more to be done. I heard you say it, I heard others say it. Can you give us granular, two specific things, and Mr. Parker, the same thing?
Yes, there is much more work that needs to be done around representation of diversity. That is an area of opportunity within our firm. Although we've seen year-over-year progress, we'd like to see more diverse representation at the senior levels and at the frozen middle as well.
And I know my time's up, Mr. Parker, real quick.
Transparency and accountability.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, I thank her for that, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to work with you here on all our issues in the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I thank you for this hearing, and of course, thank all the witnesses for being here with us today or on the screen. The topic of diversity and inclusion is so important to the financial services industry, but it's especially important in the investment industry, one that works to build wealth and whose workforce is skilled and knowledgeable in creating financial opportunity. My district is 77% Latino. We as Latinos are the fastest growing market in the United States. The Department of Labor found that Spanish-speaking Americans are expected to account for almost 65% of labor force growth through 2029, adding 7 million new workers. Yet many institutions, from wealth managers to credit providers, have not actively sought to reach this growing market, and their workforce does not reflect it. Not only that, but cultural barriers exist for members of the community that have been historically disenfranchised. My question is for Mr. Pan. In your work representing regulated funds, you have come across cultural and institutional barriers that are longstanding as they are resilient. I'm glad to see that your organization is making concerted efforts to reach a more diverse workforce. So thank you for that. I understand this is a growing effort that is constantly under development, so I just wanted to highlight an important issue facing my district and many others, simply put, language barriers. So I want to ask you this. Is the ICI exploring ways to reach future job applicants whose primary language is not English?
So we have not discussed this, but Congresswoman, thank you for your comment, because I will bring this to the attention of our Board of Governors and the importance, as you've laid out, of making sure that we are able to access everybody in America, regardless of what language they're speaking.
Well, thank you. Mr. Parker, what about your organization?
Yes, our organization is made up of all people of color, primarily African Americans and Latino. And we work very hard with trying to connect with young people through our Fast Track program, a Young Professionals program, to demystify this world of financial services. And we're doing that with some of our strategic partners. So it's very intentional.
Thank you. I've also been very concerned about the impact that the pandemic has had on women in the workforce, particularly working mothers. A recent survey of 40,000 women in corporate America found that many of them have considered either leaving or downshifting their careers due to the pressures from balancing work and family. My question is to you, Ms. Gadsden-Williams. I know your firm has done a lot to hire diverse candidates for entry-level positions and also for your board. What are you doing for those in the middle, especially those who are in the parenting stages of their lives? What are you doing specifically to support working mothers?
So speaking about the pandemic specifically, our priority at BlackRock is to ensure that the health and safety of our employees is paramount number one. So in
Can we
support
speak to working mothers, please?
to
Sorry,
working
my time is
mothers, we
limited.
provide all types of virtual programming and such to ensure that they are still connected. For those who have caregiving responsibilities, we have buddy programs and the like. So we do have support programs for working mothers and individuals who may have had a tough time based on the research that you're citing to continue to engage in the organization during the course of the pandemic.
Do y'all provide child care or a child care stipend to your working parents?
We do. I do not know the details of our programming, but someone on my team, we will get back to your office on those details.
Okay, Mr. Is it Taraporevala? What about your firm, sir? What are you doing
So
for
first-
working mothers?
Yes, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge your point that the effects of the pandemic have been particularly acute for working women. I actually believe that where the workforce and the workplace of the future are headed, which is towards more either hybrid or home working
What
arrangements.
specifically, sir, excuse me, just reclaiming my time. I've only got like 20 more seconds. What are you doing specifically for working mothers?
We are supporting more hybrid working arrangements, which working mothers are more likely to
Well, sir,
avail
with all
themselves
due respect,
of
just about
home-based.
the whole world has because of the pandemic, but what specifically are you doing to be supportive to make sure that we retain them or make sure that they continue in their careers?
Again, we've done many of the things that we've already talked about, whether it's mentorship, sponsorship, having folks more connected with more senior leaders, and all of that is helping them as they get through this tough time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The woman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My home city of Atlanta, unfortunately, has the largest racial wealth gap in the country. But my district is also a global business hub and one of the strongest incubators of Black wealth. I know firsthand that the fates of our businesses and the people who work there are interconnected. On this committee, I'm dedicated to ensuring our business partners advance racial justice and help close the racial wealth gap through diversity, equity, and inclusion. One area where this is key is to make sure that diverse individuals can become successful asset managers. Mr. Parker, how would ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion in asset management create greater opportunities for Black wealth and closing the racial wealth gap?
Thank you for the question. It really is embedded into all of our programming, starting from our fast track to our young professionals to our women's forum, which we have 11 chapters around the country where we roll out these programs on an annual basis, inviting all of the subject matter experts from the different asset classes to participate, as well as firms that you see here in this hearing. So we try to address it from a regional standpoint, but we also look at it from what we call a workforce life cycle standpoint, starting with young professionals working all the way up to those seniors who are in transition, possibly out of the workforce as well.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. And as you mentioned in your testimony, only a small fraction of asset management firms, 8.6%, are women and minority owned. But what's even more troubling is that these firms only manage about 1% of all assets. We can't make progress on diversifying the industry and ensuring diverse firms are truly included in it until we do more to collect the data. Mr. Parker, why is tracking data so crucial to diversity and inclusion results? And can increased transparency around the utilization of diverse professional service firms, including asset managers, spur action toward improving the numbers that you cited in your testimony?
Thank you for the question. You manage what you measure. And we have said over numerous times that full transparency as to where you are, not to say or be critical, but to try to apply practices that we know that are tested in other markets that we can apply. So managing what you measure and measure what you manage is our mantra coming out of NASP.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. And mentor protege and emerging manager programs are intended to cultivate diverse and talented asset managers, but we have to be sure that those programs are working as they are intended. For example, we can't have large asset firms creating smaller firms and then just checking a box to meet program criteria, but not divesting their ownership interests. So finally, Mr. Parker, what are your opinions about the continued value of mentor protege and emerging manager programs? How would these programs be amended to be more effective in serving women and minority-owned firms as intended?
Great question, Congresswoman. We would say that a new model that should be introduced in the mentor-protege relationship is accountability. And that is for the mentor to have some accountability on the outcome of the performance of the protege as the protege continues to go through the different professional stages of their ability to service their particular clients. So this relationship is something that we're going to be introducing across several of our programs, but having the mentor being accountable for the outcomes of that protege tied to the relationships they have with their shareholders and stakeholders.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. And Madam Chair, I will yield back the balance of my time, but I want to thank you for this hearing today. And as we continue to do our work on this committee to make sure that we are closing the racial wealth gap, which unfortunately my home city of Atlanta leads the country in. I'm committed to this work and I appreciate your leadership in getting this done. Thank you.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Georgia. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Beatty, for always centering since the beginning of my days here last term until now. And of course, thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for continuing to support the work of Chairwoman Beatty. You know, I think it's really important as a person that did organizing for a long time, this conversation and debate about equity versus equality. You know, something I learned very on, Chairwoman, and for the panelists and my colleagues, is that, you know, equality is giving everybody the same pair of shoes. Just give everybody a pair of shoes. Equity is giving them a pair of shoes that actually fit. It's something that I learned. I don't know where I picked it up from, but I remember that, and it really stuck with me in understanding the difference. But let me get to many of the panelists here, and thank you so much for your patience and sticking with us on really important questions and fully understanding how we can be helpful and be a partner here. With $47 trillion in assets under management, you know, the decisions that these, you know, firms make with regards to diversity and inclusion have implications for the entire financial services industry and our economy. And I think that's why we're having this hearing. And as the committee's report found, we have a lot of work to do. The industry does. And I'd like to, you know, ask all of you about the SEC's, you know, recommendations for diversifying the industry. You know, in July, the SEC's Asset Management Advisory Committee, Subcommittee on Diversity Inclusion found, quote, widespread gender and racial bias in the decisions by those in positions making asset and asset manager allocation decisions regarding who manages money for governments, universities, charities, foundations, and the institutional market in general. The committee made a number of recommendations. They went on in stating that investors, the industry, the public markets would benefit by SEC guidance that clarifies that a wide variety of factors may be considered by fiduciaries in their selection of asset management firms, and that fulfillment of one's fiduciary duty in this context does not require automatic exclusion of asset managers who are newer to the industry or who do not already have certain level of AUM. So, Mr. Pan, Ms. Taraporevala, apologize, and Mr. Clements, if a firm acquires the services of outside asset management firms, how are they assessed? Is the assessment based exclusively on things like assets under management or years in industry, or is it more holistic evaluation completed?
So I'm happy to go first. So I cannot speak to how a specific individual firm goes about this activity, and given my position at a trade association. But what I can tell you is that different firms follow a variety of factors that are unique to their circumstances, their needs. You know, the fiduciary duty that exists today, that of the duty of care, the duty of loyalty they have to their shareholders, is something. Well, it's not only it's a fiduciary duty, but it's obviously something that all of our members take extremely seriously. And I think coming just really quickly, you know, the reason why diversity and inclusion is so important to our industry is this recognition that a diversity of viewpoints, diversity of staffing is highly consistent with ensuring that you're doing the best you can for your shareholders.
Congresswoman, this is Cyrus Taraporevala. I'll go next. Thank you for your question. Just to clarify, as a large asset manager ourselves, we're on the receiving end, if you will, in terms of that selection process that you're describing, not on the deciding end. But we do agree with, I think, what you're describing, which is a wide variety of factors should be considered in the selection process. Rarely, but very rarely, we do hire ourselves, what's called sub-advisors, another asset manager to manage part of our assets. It's a tiny part of most of what we do, we manage ourselves internally. But when we do think about sub-advisors, we do consider diversity and inclusion factors as part of that decision criteria.
And this is Mr. Clements. I would note when we in our report talked about key practices, one of those key practices is to look to remove potential barriers. So for example, looking at assets under management or track record and trying to target those better to the firm so that it better matches the needs and work for firms of all sizes while still retaining the fiduciary obligations.
No, and I agree about in regards to tracking data, how incredibly important that is in producing diversity inclusion results. Madam Chair, that's all for my question line. I really, again, cannot thank you enough for your commitment and really just determination to making sure we get this right. You were there when I asked bank CEOs at one point if they knew what environmental racism was. And it's my heart sank when every single one of them had no idea, or I heard the term. And again, my district lives it every single day. And I just was taken aback by that. But I know by including people like us in these places that are making decisions, it's going to make a huge difference. Thank you so much, Chairwoman. I yield.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all our members have testified, and all members will have 5 legislative days in which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. Please note to the witnesses here that will include the questions from members on both sides of the aisle that you did not respond to. And if some of you who were not called on, Mr. Parker, in your case, I'm sorry because the time belonged to Mr. Rose, we would certainly welcome your ideas if you have any. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, I would like to enter a statement from Diverse Asset Managers Initiative for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. This hearing is now adjourned.